Well, it turns out that it's one area that we have limited defense against, and there's not a good way to prepare foods to avoid this problem. And it's really much more absent from our consciousness, and yet in professional circles, researchers and clinicians and so on, there's a lot of dismissal going on as well. Whereas tannins and phytates are like, well, I don't know too much, that's a nutrition topic. But with oxalate, because we know oxalate causes kidney stones, it's a word that's a little bit familiar in
Mm.
clinical circles. So the like light familiarity, but basically complete ignorance gives them lots of room to just like, wow, dismiss it. And you cannot get as sick. You cannot do near the damage with tannins and with phytates that you can do with oxalate.
Mm.
Now, lectins, they're becoming, for the same reasons in a way, they're becoming more and more of a concern because we're not using professional or traditional ways of preparing beans, for example, of soaking them properly for literally, the research says you need 3.5 days of soaking and then pressure cooker level heat to disarm lectins, and you can disarm them. But lectins are a little bit confined to areas and foods that are easily avoided. Oxalates, unfortunately, are in foods that we continue to promote and trust and that continue to grow in popularity. And the only great defense is to control your exposure level. You can't cook it out or ferment it out or really work your way around it.
Mm. Yeah, I guess possibly the thing we haven't mentioned at this point is what are what are these substances and why do they exist, right? Because there's someone maybe listening to this thinking you're using all these words I've never heard of before. But so could you explain kind of why they are in plant material? Well, I'm sure they're in other foods as well, but can you explain kind of why they exist?
Well, as you say, the word oxalate is a foreign word to most people. That most people have never heard that word. Even if you've had kidney stones, you're told you had a calcium stone. No one said you had an oxalate stone, which 80% are. So it's
Mm.
not even in the vocabulary that nature makes it. It's in acid rain, it's in the soil, and it's in plants because plants make it. It's a tiny little 2 carbon natural toxin that plants can use for their health and wellness and reproduction and self-defense that really isn't designed for us to handle. And it's
Mm.
it's such an easy compound for nature to make. It's sort of the end product of oxidation that even in liver metabolism, when you break down your connective tissue, just because tissues turn over and you use up materials and have to rebuild and replace your bones, your tendons, everything every day, a certain amount of that connective tissue, certain amino acids can be metabolized into oxalate. And even more so when your liver has inflammation and you're distressed and don't have enough B1 and things like that. So it's everywhere in nature, but it's a toxin to humans, serious
Mm.
toxin. And when it's poisoning you, you can't even tell. And so it happens to be that seeds and nuts are great at producing oxalic acid for the most part. A certain leafy greens, spinach, Swiss chard, beet greens, and rhubarb leaves are known to be deadly. But today we so praise the dark leafy green. I could just see some poor ignorant youngster thinking, oh, I'll just cook the tops of my rhubarb in my rhubarb patch and literally murder themselves by mistake. I
Mm.
mean, we know people drop dead from rhubarb leaves, it's that high. And we don't stop to think, well, how much of the rhubarb stalk is okay? Just because I didn't die from it doesn't mean it isn't doing harm.
Mm. Yeah, so I mean the reason why there's oxalates in plants is to protect themselves, isn't it? So obviously if an animal or a human, eats too much of the plant's going to die. And obviously plants can't run away because they don't have legs and they've got roots into the ground, right? So it's the plant's way of basically, as you said, protecting itself.
Yeah, the botanists talk about at least 5 different roles for oxalic acid and the calcium oxalate crystals they form with it for their own well-being and reproduction and so on. And just general metabolism, they need it. And it happens to also serve them really well as defense against defense against funguses and insects and so on. In the leaf, the plants can turn oxalic acid into peroxide and help fight funguses. In the bark, The plants turn the oxalates into these little blocky calcium crystals that are harder than teeth. That makes it very hard for the insect to bore holes into the tree. It makes total sense for them. It's a way of storing calcium. It's a way of sequestering calcium, getting calcium out of the way. It's a way of managing calcium. It does so much for the plants. The plants are busy worrying about themselves, not you. And you realize if you were to go out in nature and not have a knapsack full of snacks, and you start getting hungry and you looked around for something to eat, how much is really out there that you feel you can consume and get something out of and not get sicker? Not a lot.
Yeah.
You need a hunting arrow, you need a bow, you need a snare. You would start figuring out how to trap squirrels and kill a deer in order to survive in the wilderness because there aren't enough edible plants. So hence we've invented the produce department. We've invented most of the foods that are in the produce department, including the carrot, most of the cabbage family, the modern fruits. They're all pretty much human inventions because we love the idea of eating plants. We like access to carbohydrates and textures and flavors. And we've built cultural truisms and cuisines around herb seeds and leaves and so on. So we're really interested in the plant foods for our own consumption, but we've had to breed and manufacture them because
Mm.
nature, it doesn't make sense to be edible when you're a stationary being like a
Yeah.
plant.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's interesting, based on what you just said, if you look at the research by Weston A. Price, was it in the 20s and 30s where he traveled all over the world looking for native tribes. And what he found was that animal foods were always the number one food of choice. So they would maybe supplement their foods with other non-animal foods, but their go-to foods were always animal based.
And highly prized and highly revered and part of the culture and cultural rituals and so on were all centered around this. And even in the Bible, you see that a great sacrifice is to give up a fatted calf. It's a big deal to say, "Here, God, take what nourishes us and sustain us, and be more than this for us."